A Werewolf Romance by Alpha's Claim Collection, Prologue. In the halls of Ashveil Fortress, there is a room on the eastern tower that the servants clean only in pairs. Not because it's large, it isn't. Not because it's haunted. Though some would argue otherwise. They clean it in pairs because of what lives inside it. A girl. She arrived the night of the blood moon, unconscious, half frozen, dragged from the border wall by patrol wolves who didn't know what to do with something so breakable. No pack scent on her skin, no wolf in her blood, no markings of rank or territory. Just a girl, human, ordinary, unremarkable in every way that mattered in a world built for predators. Except for one thing. Burned into the inside of her left wrist, still raw, still glowing faintly, like an ember that refused to die, was a mark no one in Ashveil had seen in over 400 years. The Vethara, the eternal mate sigil. The healers went pale when they saw it. The pack elders called an emergency council. 2 of them wept, though they'd never admit it, because the Vethara didn't appear by accident. It didn't appear by magic or mistake or moonlight. It appeared when a bond had already been decided, by something older and far less negotiable than an Alpha King's will. And the Alpha King of Ashveil, cold, war-carved, ruthless in the particular way that only grief can make a man, looked at that mark on that girl's wrist and felt the answering burn on his own skin. And he did what powerful men always do when something threatens to undo them. He locked her away, called her a complication, called the bond a curse, called her presence in his fortress an inconvenience he would deal with efficiently and without sentiment, the way he dealt with everything that threatened the careful iron order of his world. He told his council he would find a way to sever it. He told his betrothed not to concern herself. He told himself he felt nothing. He was lying about all 3. Her name is Lyra. She is 19 years old. She crossed the forbidden Ashveil border alone and on foot to find her missing younger brother, and instead found something that would fracture the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories down to its foundation. She didn't ask for this bond. Didn't ask to be marked. Didn't ask to be locked in a tower room that smells of cold stone and old iron, while a king who won't even look at her directly decides whether she lives or dies. But here is what the Alpha King of Ashveil does not yet understand about the girl in his eastern tower. She has survived things that should have broken her. She has loved people the world kept trying to take from her. She has stood in rooms full of people with power over her life and refused to make herself small enough to disappear. And the bond he is so determined to sever? It is already changing her. And her? She is already changing him. The only question, the question that will shake Ashveil to its roots, cost a king everything he built his survival on, cite and force a human girl to decide what she is willing to burn down for the people she loves, is whether either of them will admit it before it's too late. Chapter 1. The Girl at the Gate. Lyra woke up the way she always woke up in unfamiliar places, all at once. No stretch, no yawn, no slow drift toward consciousness. One moment behind her eyes was darkness. The next, she was cataloging exits. Stone ceiling, roughly 12 feet up. One door, iron-banded oak, hinges on the outside, which told her everything she needed to know about whether it was meant to keep people out or keep her in. One window, too narrow to squeeze through, its glass thick and wavy with age. A cot that smelled of lavender and something underneath the lavender, something animal and wild that made the hair on her arms stand up. She was underground, or close to it. The light through the window was the flat gray of either very early morning or very heavy cloud cover, and the air had the particular cold dampness of stone that had been cold for centuries and saw no reason to change. Her head ached. Her mouth tasted of iron. Lyra sat up slowly and took stock of herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, woken in places she didn't choose, assessed damage, decided what to do next. Her coat was gone. Her pack was gone. Her boots had been removed and placed with strange tidiness beside the cot, which bothered her more than their absence would have. Someone had taken care with that. Someone had been in this room while she was unconscious and had thought about her comfort, which meant someone had thought about her at all, which meant she was either a prisoner or a guest, and the iron-banded door suggested very strongly it was the former. She was reaching for her boot when she saw it. Her left wrist. Lyra went absolutely still. The mark covered the inside of her wrist from the base of her palm to 2 inches above the joint. Intricate as lacework, dark as a burn, still faintly luminous in the gray light. It didn't look like a brand. It looked almost like something that had grown there, organic and certain, as if it had always been beneath her skin, waiting for permission to surface. It didn't hurt. That was the wrong part. Something that looked like that should have hurt. Instead, when she pressed her thumb to the center of it, she felt a low, steady warmth, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. What in the... The door opened. Lyra's hand closed into a fist over the mark instinctively. She stood, putting the cot between herself and the entrance in a single smooth motion, her eyes locking on the figure in the doorway. A woman. Older, 60s maybe, with silver-streaked hair pulled severely back and eyes the particular shade of amber that Lyra had learned meant shifter. She carried a tray. Bread, a bowl of something steaming, a clay cup. She moved carefully, the way people moved around things they weren't sure about, and her eyes went to Lyra's closed fist before they went to her face. So she knew about the mark. "You're awake," the woman said. Her voice was low and even. "Good. You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days. You should eat." "Where am I?" "Ashveil Fortress, the Eastern Tower." "Where is my pack? My coat?" "Stored safely." "Ah, you'll have them back." The woman set the tray on the small table near the window and stepped back, giving Lyra space she hadn't asked for but noted. "My name is Dwin. I'm the pack healer. I've been attending to you since you were brought in." Lyra didn't move toward the food. "Brought in from where exactly?" "The last thing I remember is the border wall." Dwin's expression didn't change, but her scent did. Even Lyra could catch it. A faint shift, something tightening. "You were found at the northern boundary marker. You'd lost consciousness from cold exposure." "I wasn't lost. I was looking for someone." Lyra kept her voice flat and deliberate. "My brother, Cale. He's 17, dark hair, about this tall." She held a hand at shoulder height. "He crossed the Ashveil border 3 months ago, and I haven't heard from him since. I need to know if he's here. I need to know if he's—" "I understand," Dwin said quietly. "Is he here?" The pause was too long. Even a fraction of a second too long was too long, and Lyra had spent her whole life reading the pauses between words, because that was where the truth lived. "That isn't something I'm able to answer," Dwin said, which wasn't no, which meant yes, but I'm not allowed to say so, and the knowledge of it hit Lyra square in the sternum like something physical. He was here. Cale was here. Somewhere in this fortress. And she was locked in a tower room, and a healer, who smelled of fear and knew about the mark on her wrist, wasn't able to answer simple questions, which meant footsteps in the corridor outside. Not hurried, measured, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who had never needed to hurry because things arranged themselves around his pace, not the other way around. Dwin straightened almost imperceptibly. Her chin came up a fraction. Her hands, Lyra noticed, folded themselves together in front of her, not casual, controlled. The mark on Lyra's wrist flared, not painfully, just, suddenly, the warmth sharpening into something almost electric, something that traveled up her arm and lodged in her chest like a compass needle snapping north. She pressed her fist hard against her thigh and kept her face perfectly still. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A long pause, as if whoever stood there was deciding something. Then the door opened, and Lyra understood, in the way you sometimes understood things before your mind had caught up, the way your body knew a storm was coming before the clouds appeared. that everything she had thought this situation was had just become something significantly more complicated. The man in the doorway was tall. That was the ordinary thing about him, the one thing she could process plainly. Everything else arrived in fragments, because everything else was too much to take in at once. Weigh the breadth of his shoulders, the scar that crossed his jaw from left to right in a pale, clean line. The eyes, winter gray, sharp as a blade kept carefully honed, that moved to her face with the direct, assessing focus of someone who had never once needed to soften his attention for another person's comfort. He looked at her the way a man looked at something that had detonated in the middle of his carefully ordered life, and he had not forgiven it yet. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low, controlled. It didn't invite response so much as tolerate it. Lyra held his gaze and said nothing. His eyes dropped, briefly, involuntarily, to her closed fist at her side, where the warmth of the mark was still pulsing steadily against her palm. His jaw tightened by a fraction. That was all. But she caught it. He felt it too. "Leave us," he said. Not to Lyra, to Dwin. Dwin set down her cloth and walked out without a word. Now the door stayed open, but somehow that made it feel less like freedom and more like a performance of courtesy neither of them believed in. The Alpha King of Ashveil stepped into the room, and Lyra, who had been cold and confused and frightened since she woke up, felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the mark and everything to do with the expression on his face, because beneath the iron of it, beneath the control and the cold, was something she recognized. Something exhausted, something that had been fighting for a very long time and was tired down to the bone. She filed that away and kept her face neutral. "I'm told you've been asking about your brother," he said. "I have." "His name?" "Cale. 17. He came across your border 3 months ago." Something moved behind his eyes. There and gone. "There is no one by that name in my territory." The lie was clean, practiced, delivered with complete steadiness, and it was absolutely, certainly a lie. Lyra looked at the line of his jaw, at the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, at the way his eyes, for just a half second, had gone somewhere else when she said Cale's name. She said nothing. She simply looked at him and let the silence say, "I know you're lying," and watched his face for what that did. What it did was almost nothing. Almost. But in the almost, she saw what she needed to. The mark pulsed again. His hand, at his side, closed briefly into a fist. "Your presence here is temporary," he said. "The bond you carry is a complication I intend to resolve. Until I do, you'll remain in this room. You'll be fed, kept warm, and unharmed." A pause. "You have my word on the last part." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Your word?" "Yes. The word of the man who just looked me in the eye and lied about my brother." The silence that followed was very quiet and very sharp. He said nothing. She said nothing. Then he turned and walked out. Thou and the door, despite the open corridor, despite the performance of courtesy, locked behind him with a sound like something final. Lyra stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Then she uncurled her fist and looked down at the mark. It glowed with the same steady warmth as before. "Patient, certain. Don't mistake it for something it isn't." The king's voice seemed to echo, though he hadn't said those words yet. "Which part are you saying that to?" She answered silently. "Me or yourself?" She picked up the bread from the tray, sat down on the edge of the cot, and started thinking about how to find her brother. Chapter 2. Revulsion and Recognition. She had 3 days before she saw him again. 3 days of Dwin, coming twice daily, with food and careful non-answers. 3 days of the window's gray light cycling through its narrow arc of day to night today. 3 days of cataloging everything she could learn from a single room. The sounds through the walls, the pattern of the guard's footsteps in the corridor, the way the fortress breathed differently in the evening when the training yard below went quiet. She learned things. The guard changed at dawn and again at dusk. 2 wolves, young from the weight of their steps, which meant they weren't the alphas most trusted. They'd been given the human girl's watch because it was considered a simple assignment. She filed that away. The mark on her wrist was spreading, not dramatically, not yet. Inside just a thin tendril that had crept a half-inch toward her forearm while she slept on the second night, delicate as the branch of a winter tree. She'd stared at it in the gray morning light for a long time before she pressed her sleeve down over it and decided not to think about what it meant. She learned something else in those 3 days. Whatever the bond was doing, whatever the Vethara connected, it was doing it in both directions. She could feel him in the fortress. Not his thoughts. Not his emotions. Nothing that clear. Just his presence. A low gravitational pull that shifted depending on where in the building he was. When he was close, the mark warmed. When he was far, it cooled to something almost restless, like a compass that couldn't find its bearing. She paced the room on the second evening, trying to understand the sensation, and then stopped pacing when she realized she was tracking him and hated herself for it. The third morning, he came back. She heard the change in the footsteps before he reached her door, the guard's posture straightening, the small sounds of deference that wolves made for their alpha without seeming to notice they were doing it. The mark flared before the lock turned. She was sitting on the cot when he walked in. She'd chosen the sitting deliberately, not standing in defensive readiness, not positioned near the wall. Just sitting, calm. Because the most disorienting thing she could do to a man who expected her to be frightened was to not be frightened. He stopped just inside the door. Today he wore fighting leathers, dark, worn at the shoulders, the kind of worn that came from use rather than age. A council meeting before this, maybe, or a training session. His gray eyes moved across the room in their habitual sweep and landed on her with the same unnerving directness as before. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. Jay, without preamble, without the performance of civility. "And I need you to understand it clearly." Lyra folded her hands in her lap. "All right." "The bond you carry." His eyes dropped briefly to her wrist, to the sleeve covering the mark, and he seemed to make a choice about whether to address it directly before deciding against it. "Is not something I intend to honor. There are political realities in this territory that predate your arrival. Responsibilities that cannot be renegotiated by a mark that appeared on a girl I've never met." "I didn't ask it to appear," Lyra said. "I know that." "Then we're agreed it isn't my fault." Something moved in his face, not quite irritation, but the space just beside it. "That isn't the point." "Then what is the point?" She kept her voice even, genuinely curious, not combative. It seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He held her gaze for a moment before he continued. "I have a betrothed, Lady Rien of the Voss pack. The alliance between our packs will end a border war that has cost this territory 3 years of lives and resources. The union has been negotiated for 2 years. It cannot simply—" He stopped, pressed his jaw tight, continued. "I will find a way to sever the Vethara bond. Until I do, you'll remain here, fed, safe." "You mentioned safe before," Lyra said. "You said unharmed. Those are the same thing." "They're not actually." She watched his face. "Unharmed means no one hurts me. Safe means you'd prevent someone from trying to. Those are different promises." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved across her face with the look of someone recalibrating. Not in an unpleasant way, she thought. More the way a person looked when they had expected to push against something soft and found it solid instead. "Why are you here?" he said. "So, not the answer about your brother. The true answer. You walked across the Ashveil border alone, in winter, on foot, without a wolf or a weapon, or any apparent concern for what lives on this side of that wall." Lyra looked at him. "Kale is all I have," she said simply. He's 17 years old, and he's somewhere in this fortress, and you looked me in the eye 2 days ago and lied about it. So I'll ask you again. Is my brother here?" The silence this time was different from the last. She watched his jaw, the precise tension in it, the slight shift in his eyes before his control reasserted itself. Then he moved. He crossed to the window in 3 steps, stood with his back to her, and looked out at the gray afternoon with the posture of someone who had made a decision and wasn't comfortable with it. "He came across the border 3 months ago," he said. Lyra's breath left her. "He was found by a patrol, brought in for questioning." A pause. "He isn't here anymore." She stood up. "What does that mean? He isn't here anymore? What did you do with—" "He was removed from this fortress, approximately 6 weeks after he arrived, by someone other than my wolves." Theron turned from the window. "I believe he was taken by my brother's people." Lyra stared at him. "Your brother?" "Dorian, exiled 3 years ago. He's been operating beyond the mountain range, gathering forces." His gray eyes were direct now, steady, not kind, but honest in a way they hadn't been before. "Dorian collects leverage, human leverage specifically, people whose value lies not in what they can do, but in who will come looking for them." The words landed in the exact right place and the exact wrong way. Cale hadn't been lost. He'd been used as bait. Someone had known she would come. Someone had known about the Vethara before it even appeared on her skin, had placed her brother where she'd have no choice but to follow. Jit had arranged her arrival in Ashveil like pieces on a board. Lyra sat back down on the cot, slowly, because her legs made that decision before she did. Theron watched her absorb it. He didn't try to soften it. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "You said I believe," she said, when she could trust her voice again. "You're not certain." "Not entirely." "No." "Then there's still a chance he wasn't taken willingly." The pause before his answer was a fraction too long. "There's a chance." She looked up at him. "But you don't think so." He held her gaze. "I don't know what to think yet. I don't know your brother." "I do," Lyra said quietly. "He wouldn't choose Dorian. He wouldn't choose any of this. He's a 17-year-old boy who crossed a border to— He was trying to find help for us. We didn't have anything left. He thought if he could find work in shifter territory, good work, enough to—" Her throat tightened. She stopped, drew breath. She continued flat and steady. "He was trying to take care of us. That's what he was doing here. That's all it was." The room was very quiet. Theron looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Complicated, layered. The expression of a man in whose chest something had shifted without his permission. "I'll find out what I can," he said. It wasn't a promise. It was barely even an offering. But it was more than he'd given her 2 days ago. And Lyra understood the value of small increments when you were starting from nothing. She nodded. "Thank you." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, didn't turn around. "The bond," he said. "It will create sensations that feel significant. Proximity effects, emotional interference. Do not—" A pause. "Do not mistake them for something they aren't." Lyra looked at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, at the hand on the doorframe that was gripping just slightly harder than the situation required. "Which part of us?" she said quietly. "Are you saying that too?" He left without answering. The door locked. Lyra stared at the space where he'd been standing. The mark on her wrist glowed with its steady, patient warmth, and did not seem remotely interested in his instructions. Down the corridor, barely audible, she heard his footsteps stop. Just briefly. Just for a moment. Then they continued on. Sien and the fortress swallowed him back into its iron silence, and Lyra pressed her palm over the mark and thought, he stopped. He stopped walking. He felt it too. She was still sitting with that thought when, much later, she heard Dwin's approach, but different this time. Faster. The careful, measured gait gone, and replaced with something hurried and tight. The door opened. Dwin stepped inside and closed it behind her immediately, her amber eyes scanning the room from habit before they settled on Lyra's face. "There is something you need to know," Dwin said. Her voice dropped almost to nothing. "I should have told you sooner, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for it." Lyra straightened. "Tell me now." Dwin clasped her hands together. "You are not the only new arrival in this fortress today." She paused. "Lady Rienne has come. She arrived an hour ago with an escort of 30 wolves." Her eyes moved to Lyra's wrist. She knows about the mark. She knew before she arrived." Another pause. "And she did not come simply for a visit." Lyra held her gaze. What did she come for? Dwin's expression was the expression of a woman preparing someone for a wound. "She invoked a right of challenge," Dwin said quietly, "against you." Chapter 3. What the Bond Knows. Lady Rienne of the Voss pack was exactly what Lyra had expected, and nothing she was prepared for. She was tall, nearly as tall as Theron, which was unusual enough that it registered. Dark-haired, pale-skinned, with the kind of beauty that looked like it had been precisely maintained rather than casually inherited. She moved through Ashveil's great hall with the particular ease of someone who had been calculating her path through this room for years. Lyra watched her from the gallery above. She hadn't been invited to the gallery. She'd simply stopped being confined to her room the morning after Dwin's warning. The guard assigned to her door had been reassigned without explanation, and Dwin had arrived at first light with plain clothes, a pair of proper boots, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision she hoped she wouldn't regret. "You need to understand what you're in the middle of," Dwin had said. "You can't understand it from a tower room." So Lyra had spent the day moving carefully through the parts of the fortress she'd been given silent permission to access, cataloging what she found with the systematic attention she'd once applied to market routes and supplier negotiations and every other skill survival had required of her. She'd mapped 2 servant corridors and 1 unguarded passage to the lower levels before she found the gallery overlooking the Great Hall. She'd been there for an hour when Rienne arrived. The hall below had rearranged itself around Rienne, the way metal filings arrange themselves around a magnet. Theron's generals, 4 of them, all older, all bearing the particular weathered look of men who had fought real wars, stood in a loose formation near the far wall. Dwin had told her their names. Lyra had memorized them. The pack elders occupied the long table to the left, formal and watchful. And Theron. He stood at the center of the hall in the way she'd already learned to recognize as his natural position, not the highest point in the room, not the most decorated, simply the point around which everything else quietly organized itself, because he was the gravity in the space, and everyone present understood it without needing to be told. He and Rienne spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Lyra was too far away to hear the words. She didn't need to. She could read the posture. Rienne's hand on Theron's arm, deliberate, proprietary, the gesture of a woman reminding a room of a claim. Theron not removing it, which was either indifference or consideration, and Lyra couldn't tell which. Rienne's eyes moving once, briefly, upward, not to the gallery, just upward, with the small, satisfied expression of a person who has arranged something to their advantage and is quietly pleased about it. The mark on Lyra's wrist pulsed. She pressed her thumbnail into her opposite palm and breathed through it and kept her face neutral. "It's the bond," she told herself. "It's proximity interference. It's the Vethara creating sensations that feel significant. Don't mistake them for something they aren't." Below, Rienne said something that made 2 of the generals exchange a look. Theron's jaw tightened by the fraction that was becoming Lyra's private lexicon for his interior state. "Don't mistake them," Lyra told herself again. The warmth in her wrist throbbed like a second heartbeat and remained entirely unmoved by her reasoning. She left the gallery before the meeting ended. Dwin found her that evening in the small courtyard off the servants' wing, the only outdoor space Lyra had located that didn't require crossing a guarded threshold. It was barely a courtyard at all, really. A square of frost-hardened ground, a dead herb garden in a stone trough, 4 walls pressing close. But there was sky overhead. Actual sky, more gray and vast, and Lyra stood in the middle of it, with her face tipped up, and breathed the cold air, and felt marginally less like a trapped animal than she had all day. She invoked the challenge the moment she arrived, Dwin said, coming to stand beside her. Formally, in front of the elders. What does that mean exactly? What does a challenge of right cover? In old pack law, Dwin paused, choosing her words carefully. If an alpha's formally recognized mate believes the alpha has been compromised by a rival bonding, she can petition the pack council to intervene, to investigate the rival bond and determine whether it poses a threat to pack stability. Lyra processed this. And if they determine it does? Dwin was quiet for a moment too long. If the council determines the bond is destabilizing, she said finally, they have the right to order a severance rite. Lyra turned to look at her. What happens to the person the bond belongs to during a severance rite? Dwin met her eyes. The rite was designed for wolf-to-wolf bonds. In those cases, both parties survive the severance, though the recovery is difficult. A pause. For a human carrying the Vethara, she stopped. Her amber eyes were honest and apologetic. We don't know. No human has ever carried it before. We don't know was a particular kind of answer, the kind that meant we suspect but cannot say. Lyra looked back at the sky. The cold settled deeper around her. When does the council vote? She asked. They haven't set a date yet. Rien will need time to build her case, and Theron has the right to challenge the invocation before a vote is called. Dwin hesitated. Whether he will... He won't, Lyra said. Dwin blinked. You sound certain. He told me twice in 2 days to not mistake the bond for something it isn't. He's told himself the same thing more times than that. He's not going to risk his pack's political stability over a human girl he's known for 3 days. She said it plainly, without self-pity, just the facts of the situation as she understood them, which means I need to find another way. Dwin studied her carefully. Another way to what? To make myself worth keeping alive before the vote happens. Lyra pushed off the stone wall. You said the Vethara amplifies the person carrying it, unlocks something. She looked at Dwin directly. What does it unlock in a human? Dwin opened her mouth. A sound cut across the courtyard, high and sharp and carried on the wind from the direction of the northern wall. A scout's signal. 3 short blasts, then 1 long one, then silence. Dwin went rigid. What is that? Lyra asked. The old healer's face had gone the color of the frost-hardened ground. 3 short and 1 long, she said quietly. It's the signal for an army sighting. She was already turning toward the door. Lyra was half a step behind her. Whose army? Lyra demanded. Dwin didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because from the corridor inside, the fortress came the sudden sound of boots. Multiple sets, urgent, purposeful. And above it all, Theron's voice giving orders in a low, controlled tone that somehow carried through stone walls as though the fortress itself was listening. And beneath the boots, beneath the orders, beneath the cold wind cutting across the courtyard, Lyra heard something else. The mark on her wrist flared so sharply that she grabbed it with her opposite hand, pressing hard against the burning. Not the steady warmth of proximity, not the gentle pulse of the bond doing its patient, persistent work. Something new. Something she hadn't felt in the 3 days since she'd woken in the tower. Fear. Not her fear. His. She pressed her palm over the mark and stood in the frost-cold courtyard with the wind pulling at her hair, and understood, with the specific clarity of something the bond knew before she did, that whatever had just appeared on Ashveil's northern horizon, it wasn't just Dorian's army. From the courtyard wall, if you climbed the eastern steps to the second parapet and looked north, you could see the distant tree line where the mountain pass met the open valley. Lyra climbed the steps. She looked north. Far away, small as toys, numerous as ants, moving with the particular organized purpose of something that had been planned for a very long time. Torches flickered in the early dark. Dozens of them. Too many. She didn't know much about warfare, but she knew numbers. And she knew that the fortress wall between her and those torches was suddenly the most important wall in her world. The mark on her wrist burned steadily. Below her in the great hall, she heard Theron's voice again, clipped, commanding, utterly controlled. And riding at the front of that distant torchlit column, too far to see clearly, but close enough that the bond seemed to know, seemed to reach toward the information the way a tongue found a wound, a figure on horseback, young, dark-haired, saw at Dorian's right hand. Lyra's breath left her in a single white cloud in the freezing air. Kale. Chapter 4. The Vault and the Lie. The note arrived under her door sometime before midnight. Lyra found it when she couldn't sleep, which was all of midnight, all of the hour before it, and all of the 2 hours before that. She'd lain on the cot with the mark burning against her wrist, and the image of that distant figure on horseback branded behind her eyes, and sleep had not come anywhere close to her. She'd been pacing when the thin slip of paper appeared beneath the iron-banded door. Sliding through with the silence of something that had been rehearsed, she picked it up. Your brother is in the lower vaults. East passage, third door. Come now, come alone. Tell no one. The handwriting was sharp and economical. No flourishes, no wasted strokes. She recognized it immediately, or thought she did. The same controlled, deliberate hand that signed the documents she'd seen Dwin carry. Theron's handwriting. Lyra stood with the note in her hands for a long moment. See, every sensible thought she had told her the same thing in the same voice. Don't. Don't go alone. Don't go at night. Don't walk willingly into the lower levels of a fortress where half the people wanted her dead, and the other half hadn't decided yet. But the torchlight column she'd watched from the parapet hours ago had numbered in the dozens at minimum. Dorian's army was 3 days out. Whatever was going to happen to Kale once that army arrived, whatever role he was being made to play, was going to happen whether or not Lyra was cautious. She put on her boots and went. The lower vaults smelled of nullstone. She didn't know what nullstone was until she felt it, a strange, pressing quality to the air as she descended the east passage, something that felt like the atmospheric equivalent of holding your breath. Her ears didn't pop. Nothing physically changed. But something in the quality of the space was different, dampened, as if whatever made this fortress alive had been carefully filtered out. The mark on her wrist went quiet. Not cool, not warm. Just silent. For the first time since she'd woken in the tower, the steady, low pulse of the bond simply stopped, and the absence of it was so disorienting that Lyra paused on the stone steps and had to grip the wall until the vertigo passed. The third door in the east passage was ajar. Amber light from a single torch inside, stretching a thin line across the passage floor. She pushed the door open with her fingertips. Theron was already there. He stood at the far wall with his back to the door, examining the nullstone veins worked into the masonry, thick deposits of dull gray mineral that ran through the rock in jagged seams, absorbing the torchlight without reflecting it. He turned when she entered. His face told her everything immediately. He had not sent the note. It was there in the fraction of tension around his eyes, the same micro-expression she was learning as his specific tell, and in the way he looked at her and then past her to the passage outside, and in the set of his jaw, which was the particular set of a man who has just understood that he has walked into exactly the thing he should have seen coming. "You got a note," she said. Not a question. "So did you," he said. His eyes were moving across the vault, cataloging exits, threat positions, doing what she'd done when she'd woken in the tower, but faster and with the competence of someone who'd done it in actual danger before. Close the door. If someone locked us in, close the door. Quiet, urgent. She closed it. The lock engaged from the outside with a sound that reverberated through the null-stone walls in a way that felt final. Theron crossed to the door in 2 strides and tested it. His hand didn't immediately find the wolf strength she'd seen him carry in every movement above ground. He tried again, bracing his shoulder against the iron-banded wood, and she saw the exact moment he understood what the null stone in the walls was doing. Not just dampening atmosphere, but actively suppressing his ability. His shift, his strength, the heightened senses that made him a predator above ground. Down here, he was only a man. His eyes, when he turned from the door, were very still. "Can you break it?" she asked. "Not easily, not quickly." He said it without drama, just the clear assessment of someone calibrating options. "The null stone in the walls is deep-veined, full suppression. I can't call for the pack. The signal won't carry through this much mineral." He looked at her. "Is there anyone who knows you came down here?" "No. The note said come alone." "Mine said the same." A pause. "Someone arranged this carefully." Lyra moved to the far wall, examining the nullstone seams up close. "Rien?" "Possibly." "Not possibly." She kept her voice level. "She arrived today. She knows the fortress layout. She's been here before, on visits. She'd know about the vault. She knows about the bond, which means she knows the suppression down here would affect you more than me." She turned to look at him. "Who else in this fortress has a reason to lock us in a room together while the Northern Army arrives?" Theron looked at her for a moment. "You worked that out quickly." "I've been working everything out quickly since I got here. It's that or fall behind." She turned back to the wall. "How long before someone notices we're missing?" "My absence from the War Council will be noticed within the hour, but they'll search above ground first." He moved to the opposite wall, running his hands across the null stone, testing for weaknesses. "If we're not found by dawn, the army timeline becomes significantly more complicated." Lyra looked at him across the vault. In the torchlight, stripped of the fortress and its hierarchies and the iron composure he wore above ground like armor, he looked different. Not smaller, never smaller, but more present somehow, more real. The mark on her wrist was silent, but something else in the room was not. "Tell me about your brother," she said. He stopped moving. "How? Why?" "Because we're going to be here for at least an hour, and because I need to understand what we're actually dealing with, and because you know things about Dorian that your generals don't." She sat down on the stone floor with her back against the wall, deliberately choosing it, refusing to spend an hour in anxious motion. "And because I think you want to." The silence stretched. Then Theron crossed the vault and sat down against the opposite wall. Not close, the full width of the room between them. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and she had the sense of something heavy being picked up and examined. "Dorian was meant to be alpha," he said, "by birth order, by training, by everything our father intended." He paused. "He was also not meant for it in the ways that matter. He has intelligence and ambition, and neither is restrained by anything that resembles principle." "What did he do?" 3 years ago, for now he arranged the assassination of a neighboring alpha during a peace summit I hosted. Theron's voice was flat. "The summit was my initiative. The peace we were negotiating would have ended a 40-year conflict. Dorian believed a continued border war was more profitable than peace." A pause. "He used my name to do it, used my seal. The assassination was carried out by wolves in my colors." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "People believed it was you." "Some still do." He said it without self-pity, just the factual weight of something he'd carried for 3 years. The neighboring pack spent a year planning retaliation. The border war he wanted. He got it. I spent the next 2 years managing the fallout and proving what had actually happened. He looked up. When I finally had proof enough to exile him, I did. But he'd had 2 years to build alliances beyond the mountain range. 2 years to gather people with grievances, debts, ambitions. A pause. 2 years to collect leverage. Your brother was trying to find work, Lyra had said 2 days ago. He was trying to take care of us. 17 years old, crossing a border alone because he wanted to be useful, because Lyra had been carrying everything for both of them for years, and he was old enough to notice and young enough to walk into the first available trap. Dorian knew, she said, about the Vethara, before it appeared. Theron's eyes moved to her face. So, explain. Someone placed Kale in a position I'd have to follow. Someone knew about the bond before it appeared, which means someone knew I was your mate before either of us did. She held his gaze. Dorian has people in your fortress. The air in the vault shifted. She watched his jaw tighten and his eyes go somewhere interior and deliberate, the particular look of a man running a list of names through a filter and not enjoying the results he was finding. Rienne's invitation, he said quietly. She requested it 4 months ago, before the blood moon, before... He stopped. Before I showed up at your border wall, Lyra finished. 4 months ago, Rienne had arranged to be here, had arranged to invoke a challenge of right, had arranged the council hearing that could order a severance right, had arranged to be positioned to remove Lyra from the board before Lyra even knew she was on it. She's working with Dorian, Lyra said. Theron said nothing, but the line of his shoulders had gone to iron. The political alliance, Lyra continued, the border war resolution. It was never about peace. Rienne's family controls the Eastern Pass, the route Dorian needs to move his army directly into Ashveil territory without crossing the mountain range. If she marries you, she has access to the fortress. If the council orders my severance, Lyra paused. If I die and the bond dies with me, you lose whatever the Vethara was doing to your defenses. Haedwin said the bond amplifies. I don't know what I have that helps you, but something... Your instinct, Theron said. She looked at him. Above ground, he said, something careful in his voice, like a man confessing a thing he'd rather not. The bond operates in both directions. You know that. He paused. Since you arrived, my tactical awareness has... He stopped. Started again. I can sense threat intent differently than I could before. More immediately. It's not my own ability. It's coming through the bond from you. Lyra stared at him. I don't have any special... You read people, he said. Accurately and quickly, and without apparent effort. You read me within 20 minutes of our first conversation. You read Rienne's positioning from a gallery above the Great Hall. He met her eyes. Through the bond, when you're within range, I feel the edge of it, the outer frequency of it. A pause. It's the most effective threat detection I've ever had. The vault was very quiet. And you still want to sever it, she said. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, complicated and layered and not resolved. What I want, he said carefully, and what my pack requires from me are not always the same thing. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, at the scar along his jaw, at the exhaustion beneath the control that she'd noticed the very first day and kept noticing, the way you kept noticing a sound that wasn't quite explained. What was her name? She said. He went very still. Your mate, she said. The one who died. The torchlight moved between them. He said nothing for long enough that she thought he wouldn't. Then, Mira, just the one word, but the way he said it, the way his voice changed on that single syllable, the way everything he kept armored went briefly, involuntarily open, Lyra felt the ghost of her more clearly than any description would have made her. I'm sorry, Lyra said. She meant it completely. He looked at her with the expression of a man who hadn't been simply condoled in a long time and didn't know what to do with it when offered without agenda. Then, from above them, the sound of boots. Running. Theron was on his feet before Lyra had fully registered the sound. He crossed to the door and drove his shoulder into it 3 times. Once without result, twice without result, and the third time the lock gave with a sound like something torn, and the door swung open into the passage, and Theron stood there breathing hard with the look of a man who has forced something through willpower that Nullstone was meant to prevent. A young wolf appeared at the top of the stairs, white-faced, out of breath. "My lord!" he gasped. "The scouts! Dorian's army! They've moved! They're not 3 days out anymore." Theron straightened. "How long?" he said. The wolf swallowed. "Dawn," he said. "They'll be at the gates by dawn." Chapter 5. Cracks in the Fortress. The fortress remade itself in the hours before dawn. Lyra watched it from the corridor outside the Great Hall, the organized chaos of a war machine waking up. Soldiers moving with the specific, brisk efficiency of people who had trained for this and hoped never to use it. Armorers at their stations. Scouts dispatched and recalled and dispatched again. The low collective sound of a pack drawing tight around its center, like a fist closing. Theron was everywhere and nowhere. She caught glimpses of him. At the war table, in the corridor with his generals, on the outer wall where she could see his silhouette against the pre-dawn dark. He moved through his pack the way water moved through known channels, easy and inevitable, and the pack moved around him with the particular fluency of absolute trust. Lyra stood in her corridor and felt the mark on her wrist warm steadily, and tried not to think about what dawn would bring. "You should rest." Dwin appeared beside her, materializing from the shadows the way small, determined women sometimes did. "I can't sleep." "I know. Rest anyway." Dwin touched her elbow and steered her, gently but firmly, toward the small solar off the servants' wing that had become Lyra's unofficial territory. "Sit down, let me look at the mark." Lyra sat, extended her wrist. Dwin unwrapped the cloth Lyra had been using to keep the mark covered and made a small, careful sound. The tendril Lyra had first noticed 3 days ago, the thin branch creeping toward her forearm, had extended again. Another inch, maybe more, and its character had changed, the lines of it more defined, darker at the edges, the luminescence steadier. "It's accelerating," Dwin said, "because of last night. The null stone suppressed it for nearly an hour." "Possibly. The bond tends to compensate after suppression, like a river after a dam. When the pressure releases, it moves faster for a time." Dwin rewrapped the cloth carefully. "Or it could be accelerating because the bond itself is progressing." Lyra looked at her. "And when it reaches the heart?" Dwin met her eyes with the honest amber gaze that Lyra had come to rely on precisely because Dwin didn't soften things. "At that point, the bond is irreversible. Severance would kill you. No council order, no right, saw no political consideration would change that physical fact." "How long?" "At the current rate," Dwin calculated. 3 days, perhaps 4. 3 days. The army was at the gates in hours. Theron was managing a war on 2 fronts, the external one marching toward his walls, and the internal one Rienne had already launched through the council. And Lyra was sitting in a servant's solar, with a mark climbing her arm toward something irreversible. "Dwin," she said, "tell me what it unlocks." The healer was quiet for a moment. She sat down across from Lyra and folded her hands in a way that meant she was choosing words with care. "The Vethara was documented 400 years ago, only once. A written account, fragmentary, from a pack historian who witnessed it." She paused. "The human who carried it was a woman named Asha. She had no wolf, no rank, no apparent abilities beyond what any perceptive person might possess." Another pause. Within 6 weeks of the mark appearing, she began to exhibit what the historian called resonance. Resonance, Lyra repeated. The ability to perceive intent, not thoughts, not emotions, but the fundamental orientation of a person's will. Whether they meant harm, whether they were loyal, whether they were telling the truth. Dwin held her gaze. With absolute accuracy, without exception. The room was very still. She became, Dwin said quietly, the most effective security measure the pack had ever possessed. No spy went undetected. No traitor survived her notice. No enemy could move within her range without the pack knowing. Lyra sat with that for a moment. She thought about Rienne's hand on Theron's arm, and the cold, specific feeling she'd dismissed as the bond's interference. She thought about the scout in the gallery, the generals at the war table, the note that had come under her door. She thought about every person she'd moved through in this fortress in the past 3 days, and what she'd felt, framed as instinct, moving beneath each interaction like a current. Is it already happening? She asked. Dwin looked at her steadily. I think it's been happening since you woke up. I think you've been interpreting it as your own perceptiveness. Maybe it is my own perceptiveness. Then tell me something, Dwin said. When you first spoke to Theron, your first real conversation, before you knew anything about him, before context or logic could inform it. She paused. What did you feel from him? Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Grief, she thought. Grief and exhaustion, and the particular loneliness of someone who had decided that feeling things deeply was no longer survivable. And underneath all of it, so buried she'd almost missed it, something that was trying very hard to still be good. I felt that he was trying, she said. Dwin nodded slowly. And Rienne? Lyra didn't answer. She didn't need to. The sound of the fortress shifted above them, a new quality to the movement, more urgent, more directed. Lyra stood and crossed to the solar's small window. Through the gray pre-dawn, she could see the outer wall, the torches on it, the soldiers at their positions, and beyond the wall, where the valley met the mountain pass, light. Dozens and dozens of torches, close enough now to resolve into something real. An army arranged with the careful geometry of something that had been rehearsed, the torches steady in the windless dark. At its center, a figure on horseback. Even at this distance, she knew. The bond didn't pulse toward him. The bond had no particular interest in this figure. But something in Lyra's chest did, something older and simpler than the Vethara. Kale. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. Footsteps behind her. She turned. Theron stood in the doorway. He'd been in fighting leathers when she'd last seen him in the vault, and he was still in fighting leathers now, but something had changed in the hours between. The controlled composure hadn't slipped. It never slipped. She was beginning to understand that. But there was a quality of weight to him that hadn't been there before. The weight of a man who has looked at the thing he feared and found it exactly as large as he'd expected. He looked at Dwin first. Leave us. Dwin looked at Lyra, a brief checking glance that asked a question. Lyra nodded slightly. Dwin left. Theron crossed to the window, stood beside her, looking out at the torches. Not close enough to touch. Just close enough that the mark warmed immediately, climbing toward its full pulse. The bond reasserting itself after the nullstone's suppression, like something stretching after long constraint. Rienne is gone, he said. Lyra looked at him sharply. She left in the night. Her escort as well. His voice was neutral, but she could feel through the bond's frequency, that secondary sense Dwin had named resonance, the cold, clean anger beneath it. Not explosive anger, the worst kind, the kind that had been packed down and would remain packed down until it found the right moment. She was informed the army had moved its timeline. Apparently, that changed her calculation. She knew Dorian's timeline because she said it, Lyra said. Yes. Flat. Certain. I know that now. A pause fell between them. Below them, the fortress was preparing to receive its war. "My brother is out there," Lyra said. "I know." "He didn't go willingly. I know that the way I know things." She turned to look at Theron's profile. The scar, the jaw, the gray eyes fixed on the torchlit valley. "Whatever Dorian told your generals about Kael's loyalties, it's constructed. Kael is leverage, not a soldier." Theron was quiet for a moment. If I can verify that during the engagement." "I need more than if I can verify." She kept her voice even. "I need your word. If my brother lays down his weapon, if it becomes clear he was coerced, I need your word he won't be treated as an enemy combatant." He turned to look at her then, fully, with the directness that she'd stopped flinching from, and started reading for all the things it contained. "You have my word," he said. The torches in the valley didn't waver. The fortress breathed its prepared, waiting breath around them. Somewhere below, a wolf gave a low signal call that rippled across the outer wall in a wave. Soldiers checking in, marking their positions, committing. "There's something else," Theron said. His voice had changed, dropped slightly, become the voice he used when he was choosing to say a true thing instead of a managed one. Lyra waited. "The resonance," he said. "What you feel from people. What you've been feeling since you arrived. I need you with me in the war room. Not behind the lines, not in this solar. With me." He paused. "Dorian will have informants still inside the fortress. People who will pass signals, shift positions, feed information at the moments it costs us most. I cannot identify them with my own senses. The nullstone last night was confirmation of that. Someone inside knew exactly how to neutralize me." He held her gaze. But you can find them." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "You're trusting me with your pack's security," she said. "I'm trusting the bond," he said. The careful distinction, honest about what he was willing to admit, and what he wasn't, yet. Lyra looked at the torches in the valley. At the dark shape she was certain was her brother, shivering in the cold, playing a role he hadn't auditioned for. "All right," she said. "Then let's go to your war room." She moved toward the door. His hand caught her wrist, not the marked one, the other, light, brief. She stopped. "Lyra." Her name for the first time. Not girl, not you. Her name, in that low, controlled voice, careful as something newly handled. She looked at him over her shoulder. "If something happens today..." He stopped. His jaw tightened, began again. "I need you to understand that I know," she said quietly. She didn't entirely know, but she knew enough. The bond knew the rest. Sienna, and it was glowing steadily on her wrist, like something that had been patient for 400 years, and was no longer particularly interested in being denied. She walked out into the corridor, and after a moment's stillness, he followed her. Chapter 6. What She Offers. The war room was not what Lyra had expected. She'd imagined something formal. Flags, maps mounted on walls, the architectural dignity of a room built for strategy. Instead, it was barely a room at all. A converted antechamber off the Great Hall, its table covered in overlapping maps, weighted at the corners with whatever came to hand. A candle burning down to its last inch. 4 generals who had been awake all night, wearing it visibly on their faces. They looked at Lyra the way she'd expected them to look at her. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at the maps with the systematic attention she'd been applying to everything in this fortress since she arrived, and she let them look. Theron came in behind her. He moved to the head of the table without ceremony, and the general's attention snapped to him with the automatic precision of long habit. "Status," he said. The general nearest the window, Aldrich, the oldest of the 4, a man with iron-gray hair and the specific watchfulness of someone who had survived by never being the most obvious person in a room, spoke first. Army positioned at the valley floor, approximately 200 wolves, with a cavalry element of perhaps 40. They haven't moved since the pre-dawn position. They're waiting, Theron said. For what? A second general asked. Brennan, younger, stayed impatient in the specific way of someone whose intelligence ran ahead of his experience. For something to open, Lyra said. The table went quiet. Brennan looked at her with the expression Lyra had prepared herself for, the specific architecture of dismissal that men in rooms like this built around women who hadn't been invited. The lady from the Eastern Tower, he said. Not to her, to Theron. With respect, my lord, why? She stays, Theron said. The same two words as before, seared the same temperature. Brennan sat back. Lyra pulled the closest map toward her and found the Eastern Pass route. Dorian is waiting for Rien to open the Eastern Corridor. She controls the pass. Her family's pack holds the checkpoint. An army of 200 can't take this fortress by frontal assault. Not in a day, not in a week. But if Rien opens the Eastern Pass, Dorian can split his force. Send 40 cavalry through, while the main body holds your attention at the valley wall. She looked up. By the time you realize the eastern wall is breached, he's inside. Silence. Aldrich looked at the map. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, exactly. More the expression of a man recognizing something he'd almost seen and hadn't. The eastern wall gate has a manual release, he said slowly, from the inside. He looked at Theron. If someone inside the fortress were to... Someone inside will try, Lyra said. Or already has. She looked at the generals, one at a time, and let the resonance do what Dwyn had named it. Aldrich, solid, steady, unmistakably loyal. Brennan, frustrated, ambitious, but genuinely aligned. The third, a woman named Cass, who hadn't yet spoken, careful and measured and clean. The fourth general's name was Holt, mid-40s. He'd been looking at the map since Lyra walked in without once raising his eyes. His hands on the table were very still. Lyra looked at him. The resonance was not ambiguous. Holt, she said. The table turned toward him. He raised his eyes slowly, and she saw the exact moment he understood that she knew. He moved fast, faster than she'd expected, shoving back from the table and covering the distance to the door in 3 strides, and he would have made it if Theron hadn't been faster. Theron crossed the room in 2 steps, and had Holt against the wall with one forearm against his chest, and the sound Holt made, compressed, involuntary, confirmed everything the resonance had already told her. The room went very quiet. Theron didn't look at Holt. He looked at Lyra across the room, with the specific expression she was learning as his version of well done. Contained, not effusive, but unmistakably real. The Eastern Gate, he said to Aldrich, without releasing Holt. Take 2 wolves, secure it now. Aldrich was already moving. What followed was 3 hours that Lyra would afterward remember in fragments. The War Council stripped of Holt and rebuilt around the 4 of them, Theron, Aldrich, Brennan, Cass, and Lyra. The maps rearranged. The strategy remade with the Eastern Gate sealed, and 2 additional defenders positioned at each internal passage that led to the outer wall. Dorian's army held its position in the valley for 2 hours past dawn, and long past the point where Rien should have opened the pass. Long enough for Dorian to understand that something had gone wrong with his interior plan. When his army finally moved, it moved directly. Frontal assault on the valley wall. Deliberate, organized, and, without the eastern flanking route, ultimately insufficient for the fortress's defenses. The fighting was brutal and contained to the outer approaches, he'd wolf against wolf in the gray morning light, while Lyra stood at the inner wall and did the only thing she could do, watched the fortress's internal passages for anyone whose orientation shifted, who turned from defense towards something else. She found 2 more. A gate servant, a young soldier barely old enough to be in leathers, terrified and biddable and almost certainly coerced. She sent a runner for Aldrich both times. She didn't let herself go to the outer wall. She didn't let herself look for Kale in the chaos below. She focused on the task she'd taken on, and did it with both hands, and all the resonance the bond would give her. And she didn't cry, and she didn't shake, until the gate servant was secured, and the young soldier was in custody, and there was a brief, thin pause in the immediate demands on her attention. Then she found a section of inner wall that faced north, and she gripped the cold stone and breathed. He came in with the second wave. Theron's voice behind her. She turned. He was marked from the fighting, a cut along his forearm, already closing, the extraordinary speed of his healing visible in real time. He looked at her face before he continued. Third group through the main approach. He laid down his weapon when the outer gate held. A pause. He wasn't armed meaningfully. A sword he clearly didn't know how to use. Lyra stared at him. He's in the infirmary, Theron said. He has a minor injury from the approach. Nothing serious. He held her gaze. You should go. The sound Lyra made was not elegant. It was involuntary, urgent. The sound of something wound very tight for a very long time, suddenly released. She didn't run. She wanted to. She walked quickly, her hand trailing along the inner wall for balance, through the corridor and down the south passage and through the infirmary doors. Kale was sitting on a cot with his arm bandaged and his face the color of old wax. And when he looked up and saw her, the expression on his 17-year-old face was the specific expression of someone who has been terrified for so long, they'd stopped expecting to stop being terrified. Lyra, he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. She crossed the room and sat beside him, and put her arms around him, and he gripped her coat with both hands, and they stayed that way for a long time, without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that would be equal to 3 months, and a border wall and a fortress, and an army, and a mark that was still glowing steadily on her wrist. I'm sorry, Kale said finally, muffled into her shoulder. I thought I could find work. I know, she said. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know about Dorian or any of... I know, she said again. He pulled back and looked at her face. Then he looked at her wrist where the cloth had shifted, exposing the edge of the mark. His eyes went wide. Lyra, he said carefully. What is that? She looked at it, the dark, intricate lines of it, patient and steady and luminous in the infirmary's low light. That, she said, Nue is going to take a while to explain. Chapter 7. The night before. The battle for the valley ended by midday. Without the eastern pass, without his interior agents, without whatever signal from Rien that had never come, Dorian's frontal assault ran itself against Ashveil's walls and found them unchanged. His forces retreated to the tree line before early afternoon, not defeated, not dismantled. Withdrawn, which was worse in some ways because it meant the calculation was still running. Dorian was still out there, still counting resources and options, still waiting for a variable to shift. But the fortress stood. The evening came in gray and quiet over the aftermath. The dead counted, the wounded tended, the defenses restocked and repositioned for the next attempt that everyone understood was coming. The fortress went through its necessary rituals with the grim efficiency of a pack that had done this before and expected to do it again. Lyra found herself on the outer ramparts as the last light died. She hadn't planned to be there. She'd been walking, the specific kind of walking that wasn't going anywhere, that was just motion to give anxiety somewhere to put itself. She'd checked on Kale twice, spoken with Dwin, eaten something she couldn't remember the taste of, and then found herself climbing the outer stairs to the rampart walk, with the cold wind coming off the mountain pass like a hand against her face. So she stood at the wall and looked at the tree line. The torches were still there. Fewer now, banked for the night, but present. Patient. You should be inside. She'd felt him coming. The bond had given her 30 seconds of warming before his footsteps reached the rampart. She was getting better at reading the distinction between his approach and the general background warmth of proximity, the way you learn to distinguish one instrument in a piece of music you'd heard enough times. "Well, I know," she said. He came to stand beside her, not close, the same measured distance he maintained above ground, as if proximity were a variable he kept careful control over. He looked at the tree line. They stood that way for a while. The wind moved between them. "Dorian won't wait long," Theron said. "I know." "He'll regroup." He lost the element of surprise, and Rienne's withdrawal removes the eastern approach, but he has numbers and he has time, and he stopped. His jaw moved. "He has patience. That's always been his most dangerous quality." "It's yours too," Lyra said. He looked at her. "The patience," she said. "You both have it. You use it differently." She turned to look at him properly, because the rampart in the dark felt like one of those spaces where something could be said that wasn't possible in the lit corridors and formal rooms of the fortress. You use it to hold things together. He uses it to find the cracks. Theron was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn to read people like that?" "The market," she said simply. He raised an eyebrow. "I traded for 3 years. After our parents died, after the money ran out." Lyra's tone was flat, not self-pitying, just the facts of a life. "I learned to read suppliers and buyers and middlemen because the difference between reading someone correctly and incorrectly was whether Kale and I ate that week." She shrugged. "Say, it turns out people are the same, whether they're selling grain or planning a border war. The tells are identical. They just have different stakes." Theron looked at her for a long moment. She felt the resonance hum between them, but from him, now, she was getting something she hadn't felt before, something she didn't have a clean word for. Not the grief and exhaustion of the first days. Something more complicated, something that was trying to decide what to do with itself. "The bond is progressing," she said. "Dwin says 3 days before it's irreversible." "I know." Quiet. Direct. After which, the council's severance vote becomes academic. "I know that too." Lyra looked at the tree line, at the patient, banked torches. "Are you going to tell me again not to mistake what I feel for something it isn't?" The silence stretched long enough that the wind moved through it twice. "I've been telling myself that," Theron said. "Oh, since the first night you were here." She turned to look at him. His face in the dark was what it always was. Controlled, precise, the scar pale in the moonlight. But his eyes were doing the thing they did when the armor shifted slightly, and the exhausted man beneath it was briefly, fully present. "It isn't working," he said. As if the admission cost him something real. Lyra felt the mark pulse warmly on her wrist. "Mira," she said carefully, "you carry her like—" She stopped, choosing words. "Like a verdict, like something you decided was your fault and sentenced yourself for." His jaw tightened. "I'm not asking you to stop," she said. "I'm not asking you to stop missing her or stop carrying her. I'm asking you to—" She turned to face him fully, the cold wind between them. She loved someone who fought for things worth fighting for. I can tell that about her from the way you carry the loss. She wouldn't want the verdict. The rampart was very quiet. Theron looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Open in a specific way, the way a wound was open. Not weak, just reached. He said nothing, but something in the space between them changed. The way temperature changed before a storm, and the mark on her wrist glowed steadily, and the bond hummed its patient note, and the torches in the valley burned on below them. "There's something you need to know," he said finally. His voice had gone to the low, careful register of a true thing. Rienne didn't act alone. Her family has been in contact with Dorian for over a year. She came here specifically to ensure that if the Vethara appeared, and Dorian's people had reason to believe it would not survive long enough to matter. He paused. "They knew about you, Lyra. Before the blood moon, Before you crossed the border, they knew who you were. She looked at him. How is that possible? Because... He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. Because my pack's records contain a prophecy, old, fragmentary, largely dismissed by the elders, because the Vethara hadn't appeared in 4 centuries, and most people had decided it was allegory. He held her gaze. The prophecy describes the Vethara appearing during a time of internal war. Describes the human carrier as the instrument of the traitor's defeat. Describes the bond not as a romantic entanglement, but as... A pause. A weapon, and placed by something older than pack law into the hands of the Alpha who needs it most. Lyra held his gaze. And Dorian knew about this prophecy. He grew up with the same records I did. A pause. He's been working to prevent it for years. Everything. Your brother's capture, Rienne's placement, the trap in the vault. It was all designed to eliminate you before the bond could complete and give me what the prophecy described. The wind came off the mountain hard and cold. What does the prophecy say happens to the carrier? Lyra asked. After. Theron looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him since the vault. It doesn't specify, he said. That part appears to have been left to the people involved. The torches in the valley burned patiently below them. The mark on her wrist reached its warmth up her forearm, toward the place it was always moving toward. 3 days, Dwyn had said. Dorian was in the tree line, and Theron was looking at her with the expression of a man who had stopped telling himself not to. Then, from below, a runner's voice, urgent, carrying, My lord, message from the tree line. Dorian requests a parley. Dawn, at the valley gate. Theron closed his eyes briefly, opened them. The armor came back, smooth, inevitable, the controlled composure settling across his features like a familiar weight. But not entirely, not the way it used to. Something had been left out of the armor this time, some small but essential panel. He turned toward the stairs, then stopped. Without turning back, he said, Stay close tomorrow. 2 words that meant about 100 others. I will, she said. He went down the stairs, and Lyra stood on the rampart with the wind and the watchfires and the bond's steady warmth, and the night moved over the valley like something preparing. Chapter 8. The Alpha's Claim. Dawn came in silver and cold. The valley gate stood open, deliberately, the opening of a fortress choosing to speak rather than being forced to. Theron's idea, she'd learned from Aldrich, as she'd walked through the great hall at first light. Dorian expected to come to a closed gate, to demonstrate his power by being received at all. Theron had removed that particular satisfaction by opening the gate first. Small psychological advantages, Aldrich had said, stew with the tone of a man who had watched his alpha play this particular game for years. He collects them. Lyra stood 3 paces behind Theron's left shoulder as the parley delegation moved into the valley. This had not been discussed. She'd simply positioned herself there, and Theron had not told her to move, and Aldrich had looked at her placement, looked at Theron's unchanged posture, and said nothing. The mark on her wrist burned with steady clarity. Not every person in the delegation, 12 of Dorian's wolves in addition to the man himself, passed through the frequency of her resonance like a note through a tuning fork. She read them in seconds, catalogued, filed. Dorian was not what she'd expected. He didn't look like a villain. He was handsome in a way that was clearly related to Theron's handsomeness, the family resemblance strong, similar height, similar build, though lighter, more deliberate in his physical presentation. Where Theron's presence was gravitational, effortless, Dorian's was performed. He knew exactly how he looked walking into that valley with his delegation. He looked at Theron with the specific expression of an older brother who has decided that his younger brother's competence is a personal affront. Then he looked at Lyra. His eyes moved to her wrist, where the mark was visible at the edge of her sleeve. Something moved in his face, quickly, controlled, but not controlled quite quickly enough. Fear, the resonance said. Actual fear. Good. She held his gaze without moving and let him see that she'd noticed. Brother, Dorian said, turning his attention back to Theron. His voice was warm, practiced. It's been 3 years. Not long enough, Theron said. He didn't invest the line with emotion, just the flat arithmetic of it. Dorian smiled with everything except his eyes. Still no gift for pleasantry. He gestured at the valley, the fortress walls, the dawn sky above them. I've come to make you an offer, a reasonable one. I think you'll find... Your offer, Theron said, is built on the assumption that my internal defenses are compromised, that your eastern approach is open, and that the bond currently operating in my pack's favor can be severed by political pressure. He paused. All 3 of those assumptions are incorrect. Dorian's warm expression didn't fall, but it thinned, the performance of it becoming visible at the edges. The girl, he said, looking at Lyra. You're keeping the girl. He said, keeping the specific way a person said a word they wanted to land like an insult. She stays, Theron said. The 2 words, the 3rd time. But this time, they landed entirely differently than they had in the war room, differently than they had in the Great Hall. This time, they were said facing an army, in a valley, in front of 12 wolves, and Dorian's careful smile. And they were the declaration that Dorian had spent over a year trying to prevent. Dorian looked between them. His smile had gone. You'd risk the pack, he said. And now the performance was gone, and there was just the real thing underneath it, the cold calculus of a man counting costs. You'd risk everything for a human girl. I'd risk it for what she represents, Theron said, for the resonance that found your agents in my walls before they could open your approach route, for the ability to stand in a parley with my enemy and know in real time. He glanced at Lyra, a brief movement, barely a look, but asking. She read the delegation one more time, clear as speaking. The 3 on his left, she said quietly. They're signaling. Someone in the fortress was supposed to receive confirmation that we're occupied out here, and... She didn't finish. Theron was already turning, already lifting his hand in the signal. And from the fortress walls, the response came immediately. Wolves moving to interior positions. The internal communications of a pack operating as a single organism. And through the bond, she felt him feel the threat and act on it without the fraction of a second processing delay that lived between instinct and decision. The resonance. His, through her, through the bond. Just as Dwyn had said. Dorian watched this with the expression of a man watching a door close. It's over, Theron said. No, not triumphant. Just certain. The way weather was certain. Withdraw your forces beyond the mountain pass. What you built out there. He meant the army, the alliances, the 3 years of accumulated leverage. You can keep. I won't pursue it. But the Eastern Territory, the border approach, and any interest you have in Ashveil's internal structure ends today. Dorian looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Lyra. The prophecy said you'd be a weapon, he said, to her specifically, with the tone of a man conceding something he finds deeply offensive. It didn't say you'd be annoyingly competent about it. Lyra held his gaze. Through the resonance, she felt the shape of his decision forming. Not surrender exactly, but a recalculation. He was filing this away. He was not finished, but he was finished today. Do we have an agreement? Theron said. Dorian looked at his brother for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was, beneath all the performance, from something real, old, layered, the complicated residue of brothers who had been close once, possibly, before everything that came after. For now, he said. He turned and walked back toward the tree line with his delegation, and the valley watched him go, and Theron stood still until the last of the torches had retreated into the tree shadow, and the morning air had cleared of every presence that wasn't his own. Then he exhaled. Lyra felt it through the bond before she heard it. A release. Genuine and total. The held breath of a man who had been preparing for this for 3 years, finally finding that it had passed. She looked at his profile, at the scar, the jaw, the gray eyes moving across the valley with the practiced sweep of a man who had still not entirely stopped expecting the next threat. "He'll be back," she said. "Yes." A pause. "But not today." They stood in the valley for a moment, the cold morning around them, the fortress at their backs. Lyra. Her name, in the low, careful voice, but different from before. Less careful, more certain. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she'd first glimpsed in the vault, the open wound quality, the genuine presence beneath the control. But it was fuller now, less armored, the panel that hadn't gone back in last night remaining absent in the daylight. "The council," he said. "Rienne's invocation is still technically active. Holt is in custody. The eastern gate is secured. Rienne herself is—" He paused. "She's gone. But the procedural challenge stands until I formally answer it." Lyra looked at him. "I'm going to answer it," he said. She waited. "The Vethara stands," he said. "I'm going to tell the council that." His gray eyes were steady and direct and terrifyingly honest. "I'm going to tell them that the bond is progressing, that in 3 days it will be irreversible, and that I—" He stopped. His jaw moved, continued. That I'm not going to prevent that." The valley was very quiet around them. "You should know," he said, "that what I feel—" He stopped again. This was costing him something real. She could see it. The man who measured every word like a resource running up against the limits of that strategy. "It's not only the bond. I want to be clear about that. It isn't only the Vethara." He held her gaze. "I need you to know it isn't only the Vethara." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the vault and the torchlight, the rampart and the watchfires, the footstep that had stopped in the corridor, the way he'd positioned himself between her and the door, even in null stone suppression, involuntary and immediate, before he'd even known he was doing it. "I know," she said. He looked at her the way he had in the vault when she'd offered him simple condolence without agenda, as if he didn't quite know what to do with it. "Good," he said finally, the word coming out rougher than intended. She almost smiled. "The council meeting," she said. "When?" "This afternoon. Then we should go in." She moved toward the valley gate. "You have a fortress to run." He fell into step beside her, and this time, the careful, measured distance was gone. He walked beside her the way he walked through his own halls, without calculation, without managed proximity, just beside her. The mark on her wrist glowed warmly in the morning light, patient and certain, and entirely unsurprised. Inside the fortress, as they crossed the inner yard, Theron paused at the great hall entrance. He reached into his fighting leathers and removed something small. A ring. Plain silver, worn smooth with years of handling, not worn on a finger, but carried. Lyra could see the slight warmth of its metal, even from here, the warmth of something that had lived close to a person's body for a long time. He held it for a moment. Then he walked to the stone ledge of the inner courtyard wall and set it down carefully. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Lyra watched him set it down, and watched him step back, and watched him look at it for one long, quiet moment, with everything that needed to be said in that moment on his face, and nowhere else. Then he turned and walked into the great hall, and after a moment, Lyra followed him. Chapter 9. What survives the fire? The council met at midday. and 8-pack elders arranged around the long table in the formal chamber. Older wolves, deep settled in their authority, wearing the collective memory of Ashveil like a second skin. Lyra sat to Theron's left, and every elder present very carefully did not look at her wrist, which meant every elder present was looking at her wrist. The procedural reading of Ryan's challenge was brief. In her absence, it carried less weight than it might have. But it carried weight regardless. Old pack law didn't dissolve because its invoker had fled. The elders were required to hear it. When the reading ended, Theron spoke. He didn't stand, didn't position himself for rhetorical advantage. He sat at the table in his fighting leathers, with the valley battle still on him, and spoke in the flat, direct voice he used when he had decided that the truth was the most efficient available tool. He told them about Holt and the 2 gate agents, about Ryan's arrangement with Dorian, about the Eastern Pass, and what would have happened to the fortress and everyone in it if the plan had succeeded. Then he told them about Lyra. He was precise about it. Clinical, almost. The resonance. What it was. How it had functioned. What it had found in the fortress walls that his own considerable abilities had not. The vault's nullstone, and the tactical conversation they'd had in it. The war room, the 3 agents identified, one the eastern gate secured. The parley in the valley, the delegation read in seconds, the internal response that had sealed Dorian's last interior approach before it could activate. He laid it out in the dry arithmetic of military results, and the elders listened, and Lyra watched their faces one by one and felt the resonance move through them. Committed, she felt from Aldrich, who stood near the wall behind Theron. Utterly committed has been since before I walked in. The elders moved differently. See, complex. Tradition waited. Several of them felt the particular quality of minds genuinely changing rather than performing change, which was the best you could hope for in a room like this one. When Theron finished, the eldest of them, a woman named Orla, hair the white of deep winter, eyes the amber of old honey, looked at Lyra for a long moment. "You understand," Orla said, "that what you carry has never been carried by a human before. That we have no precedent for what you are to this pack, what role or rank the Vethara confers on someone without a wolf." "I understand," Lyra said. "The severance challenge filed by Lady Ryan is withdrawn," Theron said, "on my authority as Alpha." "The procedural, I withdraw the challenge on behalf of the Alpha," Lyra said. The room went quiet. Orla raised an eyebrow. "The challenge was filed against the bond's continuation," Lyra said. "The bond belongs equally to both parties. Now I have standing to address it." She held Orla's gaze. "I withdraw my half of the challenge. Whatever process is required on the Alpha's side, that's his to complete. But on my half," she laid her marked wrist on the table, the luminous lines of the Vethara clearly visible in the noon light. "I withdraw it." Orla looked at the mark, looked at Theron, looked back at Lyra. "You're certain," she said. "I'm certain," Lyra said. The old woman was quiet for a moment. You see, then something moved in her face. Ancient, recognizing, the expression of someone placing a piece of a story they had known for a very long time. "The prophecy," Orla said quietly, to no one in particular. "It says the carrier will know her own mind before the Alpha knows his." Her amber eyes found Lyra's. "It appears that remains accurate." The chamber held a collective breath. Then Theron said, "The bond stands." Not to Lyra, to the council, the formal declaration, news spoken in the voice that carried the weight of pack law and Alpha authority, and 3 years of a man holding something together through sheer determined will. The bond stands. One by one, the elders inclined their heads. Afterward, the fortress breathed differently. Lyra couldn't have said precisely what changed. The stones were the same, the corridors the same, the cold air from the mountain passed the same. But something in the atmosphere of the place had shifted. See the way a room's quality changed when a held tension was finally released. She found Cale in the inner yard, sitting in a patch of thin afternoon sunlight, with his arm in a proper sling, talking to a young wolf about something that was apparently very funny. Cale's particular laugh, the one that always started a beat before the joke landed, carrying across the cobblestones. She stopped and watched him from the yard entrance. "He's going to be all right," the resonance said, with the simple warmth of something not complicated. She believed it. "He has your stubbornness," said a voice beside her. Dwin, appearing from nowhere again, with the small, satisfied expression of a woman whose assessments had been proven correct. "He has his own stubbornness," Lyra said. "I just taught him what to do with it." Dwin looked at her with the particular quality of a person who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "The mark," she said finally. "Last night it was 3 days. Today—" She reached for Lyra's wrist without asking permission. They'd moved past that several days ago, and unwrapped the cloth. The mark covered the full inner forearm now, dark and precise and luminous, reaching toward the crook of the elbow, toward the path to the heart. "Less than 3 days, Dwin said. "I know." "You don't seem concerned." Lyra looked at the mark for a moment, at the intricate lines of it, the certainty of it. "I'm not," she said, which surprised her, a little, when she said it aloud. She turned the surprise over and examined it, and found it was true. Dwin rewrapped the cloth with her practiced gentleness. "The council went well," she said. "It wasn't a question." "It went well." Dwin nodded once, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had placed her bet early and seen it pay. "Get some rest tonight," she said. "All of you." She looked at the yard, at Cale in his sunlight, and her expression was fond and complicated, and full of the long perspective of a woman who had watched this fortress for decades. "Tomorrow, things will still need doing. But tonight," she paused, "tonight you've earned the quiet." She left. Lyra stood in the yard entrance and watched Cale make the young wolf laugh about something else, and felt the mark warm on her wrist, and looked up at the eastern tower where she'd woken 4 days ago, cold and alone, and cataloging exits. She wasn't cold now. She wasn't alone. She wasn't cataloging exits. Epilogue, what grows in ruins. The rain came that evening. Not the sharp, wind-driven rain of the mountain pass at its worst. Just a steady, even fall that turned the fortress's stone courtyards dark and sent the smell of wet earth up through the windows and made the indoor fires burn with particular warmth by contrast. Lyra sat at the window of the solar that had become her room, properly her room now, by Theron's instruction to Dwin that morning. Just not the Eastern Tower's holding cell, but a real room on the second level, with a proper bed and a window that actually opened. She'd left it open. The rain smell came through on the cool air and settled in the room alongside the candlelight, and she sat with her back against the stone, and her knees drawn up, and her marked wrist resting in her lap. Cale was asleep in the adjacent room. She could hear his breathing through the wall, deep and steady, and finally, the breathing of someone genuinely safe. The mark had reached the crook of her elbow during the afternoon. Dwin had checked it at dusk and said nothing except, "Soon," with the expression of a healer who had decided the outcome was acceptable, who had perhaps decided it some time ago. Lyra looked at it in the candlelight. The lines of it, the luminous dark certainty of it, covering her arm from wrist to elbow and still reaching. She felt the bond's warmth in it, patient, thorough, unhurried. It was going where it had always been going. It had never been interested in her objections. She found she didn't have any left. The door opened quietly. Theron stood in the frame. He'd changed out of fighting leathers, plain dark clothes, the scar along his jaw very clear in the candlelight. He looked at her in the window, and then at the rain outside, and then at the room, the specific surveying look she'd watched him turn on every space he entered, thus noting exits and threat positions through pure habit. "You're still awake," he said. "So are you," she answered. He came inside, left the door ajar behind him, not the performance of courtesy this time, but the actual thing, the consideration of a man in the room of someone who had spent 4 days learning the sound of every lock in this fortress. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, looking at the rain. And she looked at his profile, and the rain moved between them, and the candlelight held its quiet ground. "The council will meet again in a fortnight," he said, "to formalize the structure going forward. Your role, your rank—" He paused. "There will be resistance from some quarters. Old law doesn't accommodate you easily." "Old law didn't accommodate today easily," Lyra said. "It managed." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost. "It managed," he agreed. A pause. "Dorian," she said. "He'll try again. Not immediately. He'll recalculate, rebuild, look for another approach." Theron was looking at the rain with the steady, forward-facing patience of a man who had accepted this as simply the shape of the next years. "But the eastern approach is gone, and the interior of my pack is—" He paused. "Cleaner than it's been in a long time." "That will help." "It will." A pause. "So will what you carry." She looked at the mark on her arm. He looked at it too. "When it completes," he said carefully, "when the bond fully bonds—" He stopped. The careful voice, choosing words with the same deliberate economy she'd come to recognize as his version of vulnerability. "I want you to know what it means to me, not only strategically—" A pause. "Not primarily strategically." Lyra looked at him. His gray eyes, when he turned from the window, were the most open she'd seen them. The armor not absent. She didn't think the armor was ever entirely absent, and she had begun to think that was all right, that some people's protective structures were also just the shape of them, were worth keeping. But reduced. The essential panels genuinely down. "I know," she said. "You keep saying that. Because you keep finding complicated ways to say things that I've already felt through the bond." She held his gaze. "It goes both directions. I told you that the first time you warned me not to mistake it." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you feel?" he asked. Genuinely asking, not managed, not measured. Just asking. Lyra looked at him for a long moment. At everything she'd catalogued in 4 days with the systematic attention of someone who had survived by accuracy. The scar and the gray eyes, and the deliberate footsteps. The hand that had gripped the doorframe. The footstep that had stopped in the corridor. The way he'd said, "Mira." Just the one word, just the one syllable, just everything. "I feel," she said, "that you have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and that you're tired, and that you're good, in the specific way that people who are built hard sometimes are, not in spite of the hardness, but underneath it." She paused. "And I feel that what lives underneath it is worth the patience of waiting for it." The rain fell steadily outside. The candle held its ground. Theron looked at her with the expression she didn't have a name for yet. The one she was going to have the rest of her life to name, she realized. The one that was still new, and still finding its form, and still raw at the edges in the particular way of things recently freed from long confinement. He crossed the room and sat beside her in the window. Not the careful, measured distance, not the managed proximity. Just beside her, so close enough that the bond's warmth went full and steady between them, like a bridge completed. He didn't touch her. He looked out at the rain. She looked at the rain too. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. There would be Dorian still in the tree line. There would be council meetings and old laws, and a pack learning to accommodate something unprecedented. There would be Kyle to settle, and Dwin to reassure, and the 40-year consequences of a border war to navigate, and a bond to complete, and all the unglamorous architecture of a future that was being built in real time from materials that weren't always adequate. Tomorrow, all of that. But the rain fell on the fortress now, and the candle held its light, and the mark on her wrist glowed warmly against her arm, patient and complete and certain. And Theron of Ashveil, who had spent 3 years building walls thick enough to outlast grief, sat beside a human girl in a window in the rain and was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where he was. Not managing the moment, not surviving it, in it. Somewhere in the fortress, in a room that smelled of healing herbs and old books, Dwyn poured herself a cup of something hot and looked at the rain through her window and allowed herself a small, private smile. Somewhere in the adjacent room, Kale slept with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and had been given, at last, permission to stop. And in the tree line beyond the valley, where the banked torches had gone cold and the army had folded itself into the mountain dark, Dorian rode north on a horse that knew the route by memory, with the expression of a man revising his plans. Not finished, but finished, for now. The valley was quiet. The fortress was quiet. The rain moved over everything equally. The walls, the old stone, the courtyard, where a plain silver ring sat on a ledge, getting slowly, gently, rain-washed clean. And inside, where the candlelight held its ground against the dark, 2 people sat in a window and watched the rain and did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that the bond had not already said, and nothing left to guard against that the night had not already taken, and nothing left to do but be present in the particular, irreplaceable way of people who have found, against considerable odds and through considerable cost, exactly where they belong. Thank you for listening to No One Could Break the Alpha King, a story from the Alpha's Claim channel. If this story found its way into your chest and stayed there, if you're sitting somewhere right now, not quite ready to leave Ashveil yet, then you already know what to do. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs a story that doesn't flinch. Dorian is still in the tree line, and Ashveil's story is far from over.